everyone, welcome to Babble. I'm Megan Thomas. This is James Hendry, and today we'll be chatting about his career. Condensing it into a half-hour segment is the part I'm concerned about. Wildlife presenter and guide, writer of 3.5 books, musician, speaker, you see my concern. But I have a lot of questions I'd like to ask today, but I'll start with the easy one. How are you, James?
I'm fine. It's spring in Johannesburg, and so I'm full of the joys of spring.
Oh, very lucky. I've currently just seen the sun poke its head out over here in London. It's looking a little grey, but it's light, which is an improvement.
Yes.
I actually feel like I've met you because I've been listening to your books by audiobook, which you narrated, if I'm right in thinking.
I did one of them, yes. We've only done one. Yeah.
And what was that like? Was that fun to do?
It was a very interesting experience because I was in the bush at the time and I didn't have access to a studio. And I'm sure, as you know, if you're going to do something like this, you've got to be in a fairly dead space. And the only thing that makes a really good dead space is a car. You don't have a studio. And so I didn't have time. And because of where I was, there was always ambient noise in the area, but for the period between 4 a.m. and 5 a.m. in the morning, obviously a.m. in the morning. And so what I'd do is get up at about 3:45, make a quick cup of coffee, go and get into my, what you would call over there, a Vauxhall, my Vauxhall Astra, and I'd sit in the driver's seat with a microphone set up, wedged into various corners, and it would hang just over the steering wheel. And there for an hour, I would narrate or read through the book and then send it to a studio in Cape Town, and they eventually stuck it together. So it was, I think, an unusual experience of recording an audiobook, and certainly quite painful for the producer because there was no one there to direct me. And so, there were lots of mistakes and things that had to be rectified.
Yeah, that's certainly making a plan with what you've got.
Yeah.
And before I go into any more career stuff, I'm actually super interested to see the people just listening to this interview. We're sat in front of some guitars. Is there a story behind them? Or just
well, if I could have really chosen any career, it would have been that of a rock star. And I'm still an aspirant rock star, although very far from being one. So these instruments are an enormously important part of my life, although not an enormously important part of my income.
Yeah. Well, I mean, first step of becoming a rock star is hang guitars on the wall. That's in the guidebook.
Yeah.
So if it's even possible to do it briefly, because you've done so much, from the moment that you finished your biology and wildlife degrees at UCT to where you are now, what's been the process?
I don't think there has been one. I think it's been me lurching from one unexpected adventure or misadventure to another. And I mean, I'd finished my first degree in Pietermaritzburg in 1999, and I was going to come to Johannesburg to be a rock star, of course. And that never materialized. I was seeing a girl at the time who had the temperament and manners of a honey badger. And she said to me that we were going to go to the bush to be guides. And I said, okay, because I was terrified of her. And to make a very long and sordid story short, I was kept on guide and she was ejected. Because, well, you need to have a relatively friendly demeanor in order to guide high-paying international tourists. And so I was never going to do that. And I ended up in the bush, which was amazing. And it opened up a whole new kind of world of discovery for me. And that's how I started off being a guide in the bush, basically.
Yeah, and if I understand correctly, it was the guide notes that you had to write up that first got you into writing, though your dad thought they might have been a waste of your education after reading them.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, my parents are avid readers, have always begged me and my siblings to read. And really, I did everything I could at school to avoid reading. And my sister reads quite a lot. My brother's absolutely hopeless. But I started reading only after I basically started guiding. obviously I could read, not to a degree otherwise, but I didn't do it for pleasure, and I wasn't an avid reader. And as a result, my writing, I remember my zoology professor said to one of the zoology professors said to us all, and having never met us, having never read anything that we'd written before, he said, the trouble with South Africans is that they cannot write. And we were all deeply, deeply incensed that he could cast the slight upon our educations, and because we'd all been, or some of us, been very expensively educated. And he was absolutely right. Because when I received my first essay back from him, I realized that I actually didn't make any sense, and that my ability to communicate on paper was very poor. And that's a kind of universal South African thing, actually, in many respects. And so it was that, when it came, I was eventually, after a few years working at this reserve, I was asked if I would write the weekly sightings updates, and I started doing it. And my father, I'd send them to my dad first before I emailed him out, and he would absolutely tear them to pieces because they just didn't make sense. Sentences were too long, the tenses were all mixed up, there were apostrophes in all the wrong places. It was really appalling. And so after a process, an iterative process, sort of 10 or 12 backings and forwardings, they would then go out. But they were very, very boring. They really had absolutely no light or spark to them. They were an attempt to write in relatively grammatically correct English with as many adjectives per noun as possible, a sort of short word aloud given. So it was very purple, very boring. And I remember speaking to one of the directors of the company once. I said, I said, why is it that nobody in the reservations department ever knows what we see here? I write them these updates, and nobody seems to know. She says, oh, nobody reads those. I said, it's boring. So I was hurt, deeply taken aback that anyone could cast aspersions on my talents like that. And she kindly lent me Douglas Adams' Last Chance to See. Now, I don't know if you read that, but it's a book about his travels with Mark Cordine around the world to see endangered species. And it's the most hysterical book. And it inspired in me a desire to write wildlife-related wildlife-related subjects in a humorous manner. And that's what I've tried to do since then. And I think I can say that my writing has improved back of my father's almost violent tutelage and Douglas Adams' skill.
Yeah, I think that I certainly hadn't realized that you hardly wrote when I read them. Now, so what next process question is then what happened between that point and your first book? What was the road to that first publication?
The road to the first publication was I moved reserves and I met a young guy, 2 years younger than me, and we were sitting around the fire one night, many, many glasses of Talisker to the worse. And he said, wouldn't it be great to write a book about these stories? Sharing stories about guests and guides and the real life faulty towers that happens at these 5-star lodges around the world. And I said, yeah, I'd love to write a book. So he said, well, why don't we? And so we started off together writing A Year in the Wild. And for various reasons, he couldn't continue. And that's why it ended up as emails with one brother, with two brothers. He was one of them and I was the other. Anyway, I eventually finished the project. And that's how it came out. That was the process by it. And I very luckily had taken a publisher on a walk about 6 years prior to that. And I wrote to her and I said, A, are you still in publishing? And B, could I send you a manuscript? She said, yes, I am still in publishing. I'm the CEO of Pan Macmillan. Very useful contact. And so she, I managed to skip through, I think, a lot of the, she said, just send me the script, basically, which was very useful. And it's published. Great. And it's done quite well, certainly in South Africa.
Yeah, absolutely. So given that you worked in kind of TV and producing, that's quite a collaborative experience. So was initially your book, but then when you started writing the books by yourself, did you prefer that, or do you find that you work well in collaborative situations?
I always thought that I would. There are two aspects to that, and for me, they're very clear. In a collaborative sense, I feel like the creative juices and the creative wizardry is much higher. I think that working with somebody else on a creative project is going to create something that you didn't expect, and somebody else's creative input is always going to have a positive effect on the project. That said, I don't like working with other people where I'm responsible for writing something. Like the thought of going into a writing team like they do, especially in these American sitcoms, I find so intimidating. The idea of having to come up with ideas in a room full of people and trying to collaborate around, lines of dialogue and that sort of thing, it's not something that appeals to me. But taking creative input from somebody. So when somebody says to me, why don't you do this? Or how about we take the story from that angle? I really enjoy. I enjoy that
Yeah.
creative collaboration, but not the actual process of writing. I like to do that on my own.
Yeah. Getting inspiration, feeding off people, but then sitting down by yourself to do it.
I mean, I'd love to think that I have all the good ideas, but it's patently obvious that I don't.
Sometimes the elephant tells the story for you by making the story.
Yeah.
And so a lot of your fiction then is drawn quite heavily from your actual experiences, from the kind of guests that you experience in these 5-star private lodges to the characters themselves. I know I kind of assume that Angus would be the character that you wrote. Is that right? Is that a wild guess? Okay, yeah. Mainly because then when I was reading your website stuff, it was kind of like musician who did biology, who's worked in the wild. It was ticking off some points. And the relationships with the siblings, is that the fictitious part, or do you have a brother who you?
Most of the wildlife books are entirely fictitious. They're amalgams of characters I knew. The incidents are amalgams of incidents. There's very little there that actually appears like it really did. A lot of the time, because people actually wouldn't believe it if you wrote down some of the stuff that happened. But yeah, it's all based on experiences and stories that I've heard from other people that have been woven and stitched together. That's for the wildlife book.
Yes. And were you always planning on writing to that, or was that something your publisher encouraged?
No, I was always planning on doing it, and the publisher very kindly acquiesced to allowing me to do it.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And so I feel two ways that this usually happens, but either the sequel's harder than you expected because characters and there's expectations, or it's easier because everyone knows the characters and you can actually flesh them out a bit. Did you experience either of those?
I thought it was a little bit more difficult because I did the entire thing on my own. I didn't have any input from this friend of mine, and that's when I realized the advantage of the creative input that he brought and that other people bring to the process. So it was a much more introspective, a much more painful process. I always thought, I've got painter friends or a painter friend, and she's always said that how painful it is to create art. And I always thought it was nonsense until I started writing myself. I can't draw paint. And it was much more painful doing the second one, but in many respects more satisfying when it was done.
And so satisfying for the readers who get a new window into the characters who they'd.
Well, I hope so. Yeah. I hope so. I think every writer who finishes a project thinks that it's his best work, because or any artist, actually, any musician, any painter, sculptor, whatever, they'd hate to think that they'd regress. And so, I thought the second one was better than the first. I may be entirely wrong.
No, I tend to agree, but that's not to suggest that I didn't really love the first. I think what's great with that kind of thing is you can see what you gained from all the previous projects, and I suppose that's perhaps why your friend thinks
No,
that, or why you think that your most recent piece is your best, because you're making it knowing everything that you've done before that.
exactly.
So now, as I said, I listened to A Year in the Wild on audiobook. Your range of accents is truly impressive. Have you just always been good at them?
Thank you. Uh, I think it's just something I've always found interesting to do. So it's a bad habit of mine, but if I meet somebody who speaks with a different accent, I start to put it on almost unconsciously. And so I think it's just something that I have an ear for. I'm really bad at some, though. I was asked to do a Welsh accent the other day, and I sounded like a New Delhi street seller. And so I can't do all accents, but the ones that I can do, I really enjoy doing. I think that it's just something that when I hear a different accent, it appeals to me. And so,
Yeah.
do it.
So there's no future audiobook in which a Welsh person features now. You're going to have to write them out of your.
Yeah, I am going to have to. I'm going to have to definitely change. People.
So your most recent book, published this year, Reggie
Yeah.
and Me, that's a total change of pace from your two wildlife books. What inspired that change?
I wanted to. A friend of mine said that she felt that I needed to write something serious. So I set about doing this. I wrote a very serious half a book about race and prejudice and gender in South Africa. I took it to the publisher, and the publisher looked at me with an eyebrow turned up, and she said, "As a white male South African, you cannot write this book. This is not something that people want. They don't want to hear from you about these subjects. They want to hear about race and gender issues from Black people and women, not from the most privileged sector of South African society," which I thought, in retrospect, made a lot of sense. So I thought, well, I would like to say something about privilege and about um, uh, how things have developed in South Africa, but I'd like to do it in an amusing way. And so I basically fictionalized my childhood, and it was a bit more political. And the publisher, who's genius in my mind, said, "Listen, just take all the over stuff out, very clear from the story. People will take from it what they want to take." And so the idea, eventually, at the end of it all, was to write a funny book, a funny, engaging book that exposed. I mean, exposed makes it sound like nobody really knew what was going on at the time, but that laid bare, I suppose, some of the truths of what it meant growing up in South Africa for all sides of the spectrum, in the dying days of apartheid, and just afterwards.
Yes, well,
But in an amusing way. And I mean, I was very distressed by a review that I read from the Cape Times, which is a South African newspaper based in the Cape. And the woman or man, I don't actually know if it was a man or a woman, took from the book, she said, "This is a devastating commentary on privilege." And that's, yes, that was one aspect of it. So in one aspect, I was really quite pleased that that's what you've taken out of it. But in the other, I know that review put off potentially hundreds of readers, because it's in the news all the time and nobody wants to go and read a book about this stuff. And so I really hope that people will find it funny before they find it anything else.
yeah, well, my message out to anyone who didn't read it because they didn't want a hand mirror held in their face, I don't think that's necessary. I think there's running commentary and it's important to acknowledge it, but
Yeah.
I don't think that's. I think what's so important about it is that it's talking about how embedded it was in society rather than it being a story of privilege and its devastating effects, rather just how privilege entangles itself in people's lives and certainly South African lives at the time.
That was certainly the idea, and I hope that it comes across. And I really hope, that the greatest compliment that I can ever get, if I'm doing a talk or if somebody's talking about a book that they've read or an article that they've read or anything like that, is that they had a laugh. And that really is the highest compliment I can possibly be paid. And so I hope that was the incentive behind it, and I hope that people take that from it. I hope that they will have a laugh.
Yeah, and I mean, the best place to learn is whilst having a laugh. It's when you're most relaxed, you're most susceptible to absorbing things,
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so you also managed to publish it just before lockdown. So were you able to have launches and things? You beat it.
We had one launch, which was 2 days before I got married, on the 7th of March, and lockdown kicked in, 3 weeks after that. And so we did a few Zoom launches, but I've only done one kind of proper launch, which has been very different from the other two books where, it's great to go around book clubs. And I've done a couple of book clubs on Zoom, but I haven't been able to go and talk to schools, which I think I'd really like to. I did a couple of school talks, the first two, which were great fun, because I don't know. I found that the teens that I spoke to generally, they were looking for something light and different to take them out of the drudgery of the school day, no matter how.
Yeah.
And so that was great, and I really found a resonance with them. And I think that Reggie and me, the book, really find great resonance. I'm hoping as lockdown be able to.
So I know this is quite an unfair question to ask anyone during lockdown because it's perfectly acceptable for the answer to be absolutely sweet nothing. But what have you been up to and working on during lockdown?
Oh, I was very, very lucky because I was employed during lockdown to do live safaris. And so lockdown for me was far less painful than for 99% of those who were locked down. And I was in the bush broadcasting nature into people's homes around the world. And it made me feel truly useful, actually, because a lot of people, that was their only escape from nature and their only touch of nature. And I think a lot of people drew a lot of comfort from just being, even virtually, in nature, despite the fact that they were stuck in their homes. And so I was extremely privileged to be out in the Greater Kruger National Park, and no one else could be there. And we were broadcasting live out of the park.
Yeah, it's incredible. And also, everyone lives such fast-paced lives. Lockdown's the perfect time to really just watch a live game drive. What a wonderful thing to be able to
provide. It was. 6 hours a day. So a lot of people had that kind of time on their hands. And so it was just really a great privilege and lovely to see the audience numbers climbing as lockdown really took people off the streets and took people out of nature.
Yeah.
And that was a real privilege to be part of people's lives there.
Absolutely. And so are you writing anything at the moment?
I'm trying to turn A Year in the Wild into a movie script. I'm pretty sure that every novelist thinks that their novel would make a great film. Mine is obviously definitely going to make a great film. And so I'm hoping that I'll be able to find some interest in that once the script is done. I've got 2 other kind of writing projects on the boil or on the simmer, I suppose. One would be a 3rd Year in the Wild book. So I've called a working title Return to the Wild, something like that. And then I think that Hamish and Reggie deserve another outing. And I think that the period between, that Reggie and me deals with the period between 1976 and 1994, period, and 1994 was the end of apartheid. And Hamish has finished school, and I think that his university years between 95 and 99, as transition occurred, Mandela's first presidency and that sort of stuff, I think would be interesting. And certainly, I remember it was a very interesting time. I think that Hamish is a strange character, like the music time. So I hope to get that done.
Yeah, and also you did mention that it's basically a fictionalization of your childhood. Did you find it difficult to get that balance right, or were you just kind of memoiring it and then changing details?
Yeah, it was. I guess you'd have to ask the people who know me whether I got the balance right or not. Everyone has a different perspective of themselves and everyone else's history and the past. And I'd say about 50% of it is dead true, and 50% of it is poetic license. But a lot of it is based on me. And on the one hand, I feel a bit of a cheat doing that because it's easier than writing, say, Harry Potter, because J.K. Rowling never attended I don't think she did. Just school. And yet she created this world. And I read a lot of fantasy books, and I'm constantly astounded by people's ability to transport themselves into a world they could never have experienced and yet make it so believable. And so, on the one hand, I feel it's a bit of a cop-out, just writing basically based on my experiences. But yeah, it's what works.
Well, I mean, there's certainly arguments to be made that nothing isn't autobiographical, that you're borrowing from something, whether you actually have magical powers in a house elf or whether it's just a commentary on control and that sort of thing.
But I think also, if you look at someone like J.K. Rowling and or Robert Galbraith, that's a year. She writes as a man, and she writes Cormoran Strike. The story's told from a man's perspective in many respects, and it's so believable, and it's awe-inspiring to me that somebody is able to. I'm very nervous of writing women characters, and I don't think I always get it right, but so I think there's a real skill to doing that sort of thing, and I think that's into the next writing project that I take, I'd like to try and go out of myself a bit more, because I think that's where the real skill.
Well, what I did also find so interesting about A Year in the Wild and Back to the Bush, less Back to the Bush, more A Year in the Wild, because it's all the emails, but how to phrase this, how you manage to give character to a whole cast of people with only really using 3 or 4 voices, and how we kind of meet these people through someone else is a really interesting take. All the women that we meet, largely, other than Jules, their sister, we see through their eyes. And so that's also just a really interesting technique on how to paint a picture of someone without writing them.
It makes it easier to write them because you don't have to be true to who those characters are. You only have to be true to the impression that those characters have given the voices, for Julia, I wrote Julia's emails, and then I sent them to my sister, and she did a lot of tweaking of the language and that sort of thing. So she was a huge help in that. So the only real strong female voice in that book, actually has quite a strong woman touch.
Yeah, well,
maybe everybody.
I'm excited to see then what's to come. I won't be too microscopic when I'm reading your female characters in the next one. But it has been so great to chat to you today, James. Thank you for coming on. We're obviously going to be sharing this all over the show, so I encourage the audience to go and follow James's stuff. There's some combination of wildlife stuff and writing stuff, and it's all very interesting. I encourage everyone to also go and like and subscribe to all our different channels. We're very excited to be growing and sharing stuff with everyone, so please do that. And have a great day, James. Have a great day, everyone, and see you next.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.